Ketanji Brown Jackson has just made the biggest mistake in her judicial career. She mocked Karoline Leavitt right at the Supreme Court, calling her just a press secretary, non-lawyer. Big mistake. Karoline Leavitt responds, "Dear Justice Jackson, please explain to the public why your rulings contradict your own previous statements. What happens next will end Jackson's inviolable image forever. Please hit the like button because you're about to witness the most brutal legal confrontation in U.S. history. A U.S. veteran, along with a historical witness, will stand up, revealing the truth that will stun you. Jackson thinks she's invincible. She was wrong. When you attack someone who dares to hold hidden truths, you must prepare for war. This case is an unprecedented shock in the American judicial system. This is the day America realizes that even a Supreme Justice can be challenged by the truth. It was a normal morning in Washington, D.C. But what happened in the Supreme Court courtroom changed American history forever. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson sat upright in her center-left position on the bench, her stern eyes sweeping down over the courtroom packed with reporters and the public. Her confident posture and firm voice reflected her historic status, the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, and she knew well the weight that image carried in every word, every frown. At age 54, Jackson had become a strong voice for the liberal bloc, increasingly forthright and decisive in legal arguments, far from her early days when she was cautious with every word. Now she was more direct and straightforward than ever, especially when facing figures she deemed lacking in academic foundation. Today, her target was Karoline Leavitt, a young face of the conservative side who had never practiced law, just in her 20s, and only prominent as a White House press secretary. Leavitt's appearance to present views on voting rights had made the atmosphere in the courtroom thick with skepticism, mixed with anticipation. Jackson saw this as an opportunity to take down her opponent right in front of the public, asserting that legal credibility could not be challenged by an outsider. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice mocking like a blade tearing through the silence. "You're not a lawyer. How can you teach me about the Constitution?" Jackson emphasized each word, her mocking tone echoing throughout the courtroom, as if wanting to humiliate Leavitt from the very first moment. The pens stopped running. The cameras panned quickly. The courtroom held its breath. But Leavitt was not flustered at all. She lifted her head high, responding in a calm and icy voice. "I'm not here to teach you, but to remind you of what you've forgotten." The statement dropped, sharp and concise, turning the already tense atmosphere into suffocating. In that moment, the confrontation backdrop became clear. A veteran justice bearing historic prestige facing a young, ambitious politician, one side believing in flexible interpretation of the Constitution, the other asserting that the law only has meaning when tied to people's lives. And from the very first minute, the entire room understood this would not just be a debate, but a tense battle between authority and challenge, between the past and the new generation. Jackson didn't stop at the opening mockery. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing, then continued to elevate her familiar tone in arguments, her voice echoing throughout the courtroom. "Ms. Leavitt, I've read through your file, and honestly, I don't see any achievements related to the law in there. What have you done? White House press secretary, a person who writes press releases, reads prompts to the press, spins words to protect politics. But this isn't a press room. This is the Supreme Court." A few soft whispers arose from the press seats. A few eyes glanced toward Leavitt, waiting for signs of wavering. Jackson didn't give her opponent time to breathe. She continued, "You want to stand before this court, where the most important issues of the Republic are argued, but without legal experience, without a law degree, never argued in any court level. Do you think someone like that is qualified to explain the Constitution to me and my colleagues?" Her voice drew out, stressing hard on the word Constitution, as if to engrave the disparity in status. Leavitt still sat straight-backed, her eyes not leaving the justice, but the tension was evident in her hand placed on the file. Jackson noticed that. She added another blow. "What do you know about the 14th Amendment? Specifically the clause on equal protection under the law. Tell me, Leavitt, where in that amendment does it say that states are forced to change their election laws just because a few groups feel inconvenienced?" The question was like a set trap. Reporters in the room all bowed down to jot quickly. Leavitt pursed her lips, trying to keep her breathing calm, but a slight hesitation still flashed by. Jackson immediately seized it. "Ah, I see. You can't answer right away because you've never truly studied case law. Let me clarify further. So what about the 15th Amendment? It says that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race." "Correct. But does it require a state to abandon basic measures, like requiring voters to present ID? I've never seen any such line. Or do you want to add words to the Constitution? The question ended. The entire courtroom seemed to pause for a beat. Jackson leaned back in her chair, her hands interlaced, a faint smile on her lips, clearly believing she had put the young opponent in a bind. The other justices maintained neutrality, but a few eyes leaned toward Jackson, with a bit of sympathy for her experienced argument. Leavitt glanced at the file in front of her, then took a deep breath, her eyes shining with determination. But in those brief seconds, the hesitation was enough to create the impression that she was being overwhelmed. A reporter in the front row shook his head slightly, noting Leavitt defensive. In the back, a few small coughs sounded, not from illness, but as a sign of discomfort, seeing a seemingly unbalanced confrontation. Jackson tapped her finger lightly on the wooden table, continuing to drill deep. This is exactly what I wanted to say from the beginning, Miss Leavitt. Your skills are elementary, basic. You're used to repeating slogans in press rooms, but here we don't repeat slogans. We seek legal basis, precedents, and constitutional principles. Can you provide anything besides slogans? Each question rang out like a hammer blow, intentionally making the courtroom believe that Leavitt was just an outsider daring to venture into the sacred place of the law. Under the relentless pressure, Leavitt was forced to stay defensive. She gripped the file cover tightly, nodded slightly as if reassuring herself, then responded in a calm but slow voice. Ma'am, I will answer, but I want to ensure that when I do, I won't be interrupted. The short response made some people in the courtroom lean slightly, surprised by that gentle toughness, but everyone could see clearly in the first round. The initiative still lay in Ketanji Brown Jackson's hands, who had preempted her opponent with mockery of background and trap questions about the Constitution.
While Leavitt had only managed to erect a defensive shield, waiting for a counterattack opportunity.
Leavitt sat still for a moment after enduring the barrage of attacks, her eyes quickly scanning the file in front of her, then suddenly flipping open a pre-clipped sheet inside. She looked up, her voice clear, loud enough for all to hear. Dear Justice Jackson, you just questioned me about the amendments, about legal fundamentals, but I want to start by reminding you of your own words, not mine. The atmosphere stirred slightly. A few reporters jumped up, pointing cameras. Leavitt held up a printout, white paper with bold printed lines. On April 12, 2019, in a public discussion at Harvard University, you said every ruling of mine, to the extent possible, must be based on data and reliable scientific evidence. Otherwise, we will fall into arbitrariness. The words were read slowly, emphasized, making the echo drop like hammer blows. Jackson tilted her head slightly, her lips pursed tightly, not reacting immediately. Leavitt lowered the paper, continuing, her voice becoming sharper. Ma'am, those are the words you affirmed before hundreds of students, scholars, and press. Yet, in the case about voter ID requirements in Indiana, you ignored data from 3 independent research institutes showing that this measure significantly reduced voter participation rates among the elderly and minority communities. You called that data not convincing enough. But just a year later, in an environmental-related case, you cited the sole research from a private organization as the basis to argue that the regulation must be maintained. When data supports your view, you elevate it to a standard. When it goes against, you dismiss it. A wave of whispers rose in the courtroom. Some reporters bowed down, typing furiously. A few in the public shook their heads slightly. Leavitt looked straight at Jackson, not breaking eye contact. So I ask, where is the consistent principle you once committed to? Does data have value when it clarifies the truth, or only when it serves political views? The question hit hard, heavy, making the entire courtroom fall silent. Jackson blinked, her finger tapping lightly on the wooden table. She leaned toward the microphone, speaking slowly, trying to maintain calm. Miss Leavitt, your comparison is flawed. The cases you cite are completely different in legal nature. But even as she spoke, her tone had a bit of haste, lacking the initial confidence. Leavitt didn't miss it. She continued to drill deep. Legal differences cannot be an excuse to deny the truth. Voters being excluded from polling places due to unnecessary barriers is also evidence, just like the environmental data you once cited. The only difference is when data doesn't fit your pre-existing framework, it suddenly becomes unreliable. A soft "oh" escaped from the back seats. The other justices maintained calm faces, but Ketanji Brown Jackson's eyes wavered slightly, her hands clenched, a sign of restrained discomfort. Leavitt closed the file, placing her hand on top, as if marking the start of the counterattack. You asked if I have anything besides slogans. I have your words recorded clearly. I have data, which you once called the foundation of fair rulings. If today I bring it out, and you dismiss it again, isn't it you who's turning principles into slogans? The atmosphere was heavy. A few seconds of silence stretched. Jackson sat up straight, took a deep breath, her eyes returning to their usual coldness. She emphasized each word, slowly. You're quite clever, Miss Leavitt. But don't confuse rhetoric with legality. Her outward calm returned, but anyone in the room could sense Leavitt's first blow had hit, making Jackson waver momentarily, and the balance in the courtroom had begun to shift. Jackson didn't let the brief waver weaken her position. She took a really deep breath, leaned back in her chair, then tilted her head toward the microphone, her voice resounding, full of authority. Miss Leavitt, you just cleverly used my words to set up a rhetorical trap. But remember, this isn't a TV debate. This is the Supreme Court. Here, none of us needs to learn about consistency from a spokesperson. You're just a media person. Your career is built on slogans, staged news briefs, and viral tweets. The law, on the other hand, is built on centuries of academic foundation, tradition, and legal practice. Jackson emphasized the last sentences, each word echoing under the high wooden vaulted ceiling. A wave of murmurs arose. Many reporters nodded slightly, noting in their books, Jackson affirms supreme legal authority. In the public seats, a few head shakes appeared, as if they believed Leavitt could hardly escape this overwhelming position. Jackson didn't stop. She lowered her voice but stressed each word. I've spent my whole life explaining and defending the Constitution. What have you done besides protecting the image for a politician? You can spin words to attract audiences, but don't mistake information manipulation skills for legal argumentation ability. A few other justices exchanged glances, and even the neutrals felt Jackson's authority flooding the room. All lights, all lenses focused on Leavitt, waiting to see how she would crumble. But instead of retreating, Leavitt lifted her head high, her hand calmly flipping through the thick file in front of her. Her voice rang out, slow but weighty enough. Justice Jackson, you're right. I've never sat on the bench. I haven't spent 3 decades in academia, but I have something the public doesn't see in closed court sessions. In hundreds-page legal opinions, I have hidden truths. She paused, pulling out a sheet with a faint red stamp, clearly an internal document. Some reporters jumped from their seats, snapping furiously. This, Leavitt held high, is an internal memo circulated during the discussion phase of United States v. Free Speech Coalition. In the first draft, you affirmed the principle that freedom of speech, even if uncomfortable or controversial, must be absolutely protected. But in the final revision, that stance disappeared, replaced by a softer view, accepting limitations if the state cites legitimate interests. Leavitt lowered the paper, eyes looking straight at Jackson. This isn't a slogan. This is evidence that you once changed your opinion, not because of the Constitution, but because of pressure from colleagues and political opinion. A wave of whispers spread like fire through the courtroom. Keyboard clacking sounded rapidly. Journalists scrambling to record every word. A few in the public leaned forward, unbelieving what they just heard. A reporter whispered, "This is the first twist." Jackson maintained a calm face, but her eyes flashed discomfort. She tried a faint smile. "You're relying on an incomplete draft, which doesn't represent my final stance. In this work, drafts are written, revised, and debated continuously until the result reflects the correct law." Leavitt didn't let her regain the field. She slammed the file down on the table, the sound echoing in the deathly quiet room. "Ma'am, the public doesn't read those drafts. They only know the final result, and they believe it's the result of consistency. But this document shows that consistency can waver when political pressure intervenes. If that's the truth, then does the public still have reason to believe you're unchanging and protecting the Constitution?" The question dropped like an unavoidable challenge. The entire room held its breath. A justice on the left slightly frowned, while a conservative justice on the right leaned back slightly, hand on chin, as if acknowledging the value of the counterblow. Jackson twisted the pen in her hand slightly, eyes looking straight at Leavitt. She responded in a slow voice, but having lost some of the initial confidence, "Miss Leavitt, never assume that drafts reflect dishonesty. They reflect the necessary academic debate process. If you understood the law, you'd know that." Leavitt smiled faintly, responding immediately. I understand one simple thing, ma'am. When views change not because of new data or principles, but because of pressure, then the Constitution itself is treated like a bargaining chip. Those words made the courtroom erupt in fierce whispers. A few journalists dropped pens. A few in the public covered their mouths. Tension escalated to unprecedented levels from an overwhelming position. Now Jackson had to face the first direct blow to her core credibility, and everyone sensed this battle had only just begun to ignite. The atmosphere in the courtroom was still vibrating after the twist Leavitt just unleashed, the whispers like small waves bouncing back and forth. But Jackson wasn't one to be easily pushed into a corner by a young opponent. She sat up straight, her eyes flashing a cold glint, her hand tapping a beat on the wooden table, then speaking in a low and clear voice, gradually extinguishing the noises. Miss Leavitt, I think we need to clarify one thing immediately. The document you just presented, the internal memo you call evidence, is not something this law can recognize. It was never officially published, never entered into the case file, and certainly not authenticated through judicial process. In the legal world, we call that hearsay, unverified rumor. She paused a beat, her eyes sweeping around the deathly quiet courtroom, then turning back to look straight at Leavitt. You can use it in a press conference, can post it on Twitter to create public waves. But here, at the Supreme Court, we don't build rulings on the foundation of anonymous leaked papers. If that's your strongest weapon, it will shatter right upon touching the law. The counterattack was sharp as a razor, making a few reporters nod in agreement, typing furiously on keyboards. Some in the room, who had just been shocked by Leavitt's document, now began to lean toward thinking that perhaps Jackson had regained the field. But she didn't stop. Jackson slightly bowed her head, picking up a small file pushed by her assistant, then flipping through pages slowly, as if prepared for this moment. Miss Leavitt, she continued, her voice increasingly icy, you say I changed views because of pressure, but I want to remind you, and this entire courtroom, that you yourself once changed your words, not in a courtroom, but before all of America. Remember July 15th, 2022, when you were still a spokesperson for the congressional campaign in New Hampshire. You declared, and I quote exactly, state laws were written to protect absolute transparency in elections, and no legal citizen can be prevented by reasonable measures. Jackson paused, her eyes pinning Leavitt. Yet just a few weeks later, facing a tough question from a local reporter, you awkwardly admitted that you couldn't verify the data on the impact of those measures, and that further research is needed. Don't you see? That's not consistency. That's ignorance concealed by words. A spokesperson doesn't have the obligation to be absolutely accurate, but someone claiming to be at the level to stand here today, before this court, can't rely on patched-together statements. Whispers spread throughout the courtroom again. A few let out small chuckles, as if Jackson had just landed a fatal blow. Camera lenses flashed continuously at Leavitt's face, waiting for her reaction, and right then, Leavitt momentarily froze. Her eyes blinked lightly, her hand on the file slightly retracted. In that instant, her silence seemed to confirm Jackson's words, that Leavitt herself had made mistakes, had been flustered before tough questions. Jackson clearly felt the advantage returning. She tapped the pen tip lightly on the table, her voice mocking. Don't forget, Miss Leavitt, in legal studies we have a principle. Whoever has been inconsistent in arguments can hardly convince when criticizing others for inconsistency. Perhaps you should remember that before trying to stand on equal footing here, a few reporters looked up, their eyes lighting up with excitement. This was clearly the moment Jackson unleashed her fiercest counterblow from the start of the session. But Leavitt didn't collapse. After a few seconds of silence, she slowly raised her head, her face regaining calm. Her eyes shone with determination, and her voice rang out, not trembling, not raised, but serene as if weighing each word. Dear Justice Jackson, I've never denied that I learn from experience. I'm not a justice. I also don't have 3 decades sitting on this bench. But the difference is, I don't hide my learning. I admit when I need more data. I correct when I see I'm not enough. That's not ignorance, but honesty, because the public deserves to hear the truth, even if it's not perfect. Those words dropped like a counterweight, not noisy but firm, making the atmosphere in the courtroom pause. Reporters glanced at each other. A few stopped typing, as if digesting each word. Jackson narrowed her eyes slightly, the faint smile still on her lips, but the absolute initial confidence had a crack. Leavitt had momentarily frozen before the attack, but she didn't lose her cool, and clearly, This war hadn't yet been decided. On the contrary, it had just entered a more tense phase, where every word, every piece of evidence thrown out, could shift the fragile balance teetering before millions of followers. The atmosphere after Jackson's counterattack remained taut as a bowstring, with the entire courtroom waiting to see if Leavitt could hold her ground after the fierce blow just dealt. But instead of continuing to defend with reasoning, she slowly stood up, raising the file in front of her, her voice calm yet resonant. "Dear Justice Jackson, you say I only rely on rumors and slogans. Then let me introduce an undeniable truth, a living piece of evidence, right here in this room." All eyes turned to Leavitt. She gestured, and from the audience seats, a silver-haired man with straight shoulders, wearing a simple suit adorned with an old military badge on his chest, slowly stood up. He leaned on a wooden cane, taking a few steps forward. The courtroom fell silent. No one heard the sound of typing or whispering anymore, only the sound of his footsteps echoing on the floor. Leavitt introduced, "This is Sergeant James O'Connor, a Marine veteran who served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He is also one of hundreds of veterans denied the right to vote in the last election, due to a ruling that you, Justice Jackson, concurred with." Jackson flinched slightly, her brows furrowing, her stern face now showing a fleeting trace of unease. Sergeant O'Connor turned, facing the bench of justices directly. His voice was low, deliberate, but each word resonated. "I wore the uniform to defend this country's constitution. I once thought my right to vote was a sacred thing no one could take away. But last year when I went to the polling station in Fulton County, Georgia, I was turned away. The reason was that my ID didn't match an old record, even though everything confirmed I was a legal American citizen. I pleaded, but I was told the new law didn't allow it, and that law was upheld, thanks to the ruling you agreed to sign." He paused, taking a deep breath, his voice catching but still firm. "You say the Constitution must be interpreted to fit modern society. So what kind of society allows a man who sacrificed his youth, who buried friends in desert sand, to be denied his vote over an administrative error?" The question landed, heavy as stone. The courtroom went silent, a few people quietly wiping their eyes. A reporter muttered, "My God." Leavitt took another step forward, her voice icy. "This is not a slogan. This is not a leaked document. This is an American citizen, a veteran who shed blood to defend this flag. And you, Justice Jackson, signed the ruling that caused him, and thousands like him, to lose their right to vote." Jackson's eyes wavered noticeably. She gripped the pen tightly in her hand, then set it down on the table, her fingers tapping an unusually fast rhythm. For a few seconds, she couldn't speak. The other justices sat motionless, some looking down, others glancing at Jackson, waiting for her reaction. For the first time since the hearing began, Jackson's unshakable composure was shaken. O'Connor turned to the audience, his voice softening. "I'm not standing here to argue academics. I'm standing here because I want my children, my grandchildren, to be able to vote without being told they don't have enough paperwork. I've done my part for this country. Now I want this country to do its part for me." As he finished, the entire courtroom sank into absolute silence. Not a cough, not a keystroke, only a thick atmosphere pressing against everyone's chests. Jackson shifted in her seat, her eyes darting quickly as if searching for a rebuttal, but her face had lost its usual proud confidence. Leavitt turned back to face her, her voice clear. "You call me a media person, unfit to stand here, but my legitimacy doesn't lie in a law degree. It lies in whether I dare to bring the truth before the public. And today, that truth is standing right in front of you." Jackson pursed her lips, her eyes blinking quickly. For a moment, anger flashed clearly, then she leaned down to scribble a few lines, as if to regain control. But everyone saw it. This blow of living evidence was unlike any argument before. It pierced through the armor of theory, striking straight at the heart of the hearing, and for the first time, Ketanji Brown Jackson lost emotional control in the very room where she always held total authority. The room still echoed with the aftermath of Sergeant O'Connor's testimony, but Jackson didn't let that silence weigh her down further. She raised her head, regaining her resolve, her voice sharper than usual. "Miss Leavitt, don't think I can't see through your tactics. This isn't a public trial where we judge the fate of a specific individual. This is where we discuss constitutional principles. You're bringing a veteran here to stir public emotion is not legal. It's political. You're performing politics, and doing so at the Supreme Court is an insult. The accusation lashed through the air like a whip, making many in the courtroom mentally jump, their hearts pounding. Cameras panned straight to Leavitt's face, waiting for her to falter, but Leavitt didn't flinch, her eyes blazing like fire. She stood firm, her voice unwavering. Ma'am, the real politics is when you use the law to pick sides, when legal decisions are no longer applied consistently, but change depending on who's affected. That's politics, not my bringing a citizen to tell his story. An O escaped from the back, then was quickly stifled in the tense atmosphere. Jackson snapped, cutting in. Don't you understand that the law must rise above emotion? If we keep chasing tears, everyday stories, what value does the Constitution have? It becomes a meaningless piece of paper. Leavitt shot back immediately, not missing a beat. If the Constitution is invoked to ignore reality, then it's meaningless. A living law matters when it protects people, not when it becomes a shield for bias. The reporter's heavy breathing sounded like a drumbeat in the background. Jackson clenched her teeth, leaning slightly toward the microphone. You're still just repeating slogans. I hear no law in that, only cheap political rhetoric. You're trying to create a spectacle for the media, and you know it. Leavitt's lips curled slightly, her voice turning cold as steel. If bringing the truth to light is a spectacle, then let the entire nation watch who's writing the script. I'm not standing here for applause. I'm standing here to question the consistency of someone who once claimed to base decisions on data and evidence, but dismisses them when they're inconvenient. Jackson exhaled sharply through her nose, the sound carrying through the microphone like a signal of anger. She gripped the pen tightly, then let go, her eyes glaring. Miss Leavitt, you're too young, too inexperienced to understand that in law, change is necessary to adapt to context. Leavitt jumped in, leaving no gap. Then why do you claim to be steadfast in principle? Why did you tell students that data is an unwavering foundation, adaptation or excuse? I see no adaptation here. I see only selective convenience. Jackson shot up straight, her voice rising sharply. You're insulting the Supreme Court. Leavitt didn't back down, her eyes piercing her opponent, her voice resolute. No, ma'am. I'm defending the Supreme Court from becoming a political tool in any side's hands, even when that side claims flexibility. The atmosphere exploded. Some in the audience covered their mouths. A few reporters nearly leapt from their seats, scribbling furiously. This was the moment no one in the room could look away from a Supreme Justice, a historic figure, facing off directly with a young politician, each word thrown like a dagger, each response a shield sparking fire. Jackson glared, her voice slightly hoarse with anger. You think you can challenge my authority? My entire life has been dedicated to this law. Leavitt replied instantly, her voice solid as stone. Authority doesn't lie, in the years you've sat in that chair, but in the trust the public places in your rulings. When rulings betray that trust, all authority is meaningless. The statement landed like a hammer striking the thick air. A long silence followed, no one daring to breathe heavily. Then Jackson sank back into her chair, her hands trembling slightly, but still trying to maintain a calm face. Leavitt stood tall, her eyes not leaving her opponent, as if waiting for the next blow. The first climax of the confrontation had arrived. Extreme tension. Words like clashing blades and clearly no longer just a legal argument, but a life or death battle over credibility, principles, and the nation's trust. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy after the direct verbal clash. Everyone was still catching their breath when Leavitt suddenly leaned down, pulling out a thick file marked with colored tabs. She placed it on the podium, flipping through pages with the calm of someone meticulously prepared for this moment. Her voice rang out, clear, each word emphasized. Dear Justice Jackson, you say I only use emotion to sway public opinion, but for the public to understand, they need the truth. And the truth lies right in the cases you've handled, in your own arguments. She held up a page, American Free Speech Alliance, 1st District of Columbia, 2017. Back then, you affirmed that free speech is an inviolable pillar, no matter how uncomfortable the content. I quote verbatim, if a government can restrict speech just because it's controversial, the Constitution loses its purpose. Those are your words. Leavitt paused, letting the courtroom absorb the words. Then she flipped to another page, her eyes never leaving Jackson. But in United States' first Social Media Oversight Board, 2021, you wrote, The government has a responsibility to protect the public from harmful content, and within that scope, certain restrictions on speech are necessary. So where's the principle? One time you defend absolute free speech, another you say restrictions are justified. Which principle truly guides you? Justice. The sound in the courtroom shifted, whispers growing louder, like waves crashing repeatedly. Reporters leaned closer to their tables, typing frantically. A conservative justice at the end of the row raised an eyebrow slightly, while a liberal justice quietly crossed their arms, avoiding Jackson's gaze. Jackson pursed her lips slightly, trying to stay calm, but her eyes were no longer as steady. Leavitt sensed the moment and pressed on. And here, People for Equal Ballot Access, v. Georgia, 2019. You said, data cannot be invoked when it only proves a localized phenomenon, for the Constitution was written to protect principles, not chase numbers. But in Environmental Protection League, Department of Energy, 2020, you wrote scientific data showing severe environmental impact is a solid basis for maintaining regulations. When data supports your argument, you call it a solid basis. When it opposes, you call it a localized phenomenon. Is this the honesty of principle? A few O's escaped from the back, then quickly faded into tense silence. Jackson shifted slightly, her hand unconsciously tapping the table, but she didn't rush to rebut. Leavitt lowered the file, her voice turning colder. You say I'm performing politics, but I'm reading your own words, in official opinions. That's not performance, it's reflection, and what it reflects shows clearly. You don't apply the same principle to every interest group. For environmental organizations, you expand speech, expand authority. For conservative citizen groups, you restrict, you call it necessary. Jackson tilted her head slightly, her eyes flashing irritation. She started to bring the microphone up to respond, but Leavitt swiftly cut in with a final blow. Allow me to read a statement you made at Harvard Law Institute in 2015. My principle is consistent. No matter who stands before the court, I will apply the same standard. Ma'am, today when I present contradictory evidence, you call it performance. So were your 2015 words also a performance? The courtroom erupted in a wave of murmurs, as if the wooden benches shook along. Reporters snapped up, cameras flashing relentlessly. A few in the audience couldn't hold back, letting out audible gasps. This was the second twist, and this time, it didn't come from a leaked memo or a standing witness, but from the very documents bearing Jackson's signature, the very words she had spoken publicly. Jackson sat motionless, her face taut, her hand gripping the pen so tightly, her knuckles whitened. She tilted her head slightly, as if searching for a gap to counter, but in those few seconds, the courtroom saw her waver. Leavitt's words weren't just rhetoric, they were an arrow piercing straight at Jackson's core credibility, her consistency and principle. Leavitt closed the file, her voice calm but resonant. The public can forgive mistakes, but they won't forgive pretending to be consistent. When principles shift based on who's involved, that's no longer justice, it's political choice, dressed in legal robes. The atmosphere sank, heavy enough to hear each person's breath. A data-driven reversal had been unleashed, and for the first time, Jackson's silence was no longer strength, but a sign of a crack. The air in the courtroom grew thick after Leavitt closed the file. Her final words still echoed in everyone's minds. When principles shift based on who's involved, that's no longer justice, it's political choice, dressed in legal robes. All eyes turned to the high bench, waiting for Jackson to strike back, expecting her to deliver a rebuttal, as she always had. But the most surprising thing happened. She said nothing. No more sharp interruptions. No more mocking, elementary remarks. Jackson sat motionless, her hands gripping the pen tightly, eyes staring straight ahead, her face taut but lips sealed. Her silence, once seen as a display of authority, now became a strange void, unsettling the entire courtroom. Leavitt seized the opportunity. She took a half step toward the podium, her voice steady but carrying far, leveraging the silence to let each word land. Dear Justice Jackson, you once said your principles are unwavering, but the evidence I've presented, from your own rulings and statements, shows otherwise. So where's the truth? Are those principles truly unwavering, or only unwavering when they align with the outcome you desire? A faint sound came from the back, someone dropping a pen, then everything sank back into silence. Leavitt's question hung in the air, no one daring to breathe heavily. waiting for a response from the powerful chair in the center. Jackson remained still, her fingers tapping lightly on the table, but she didn't raise the microphone, didn't counter, didn't interrupt. Time seemed to stretch. Leavitt continued, her eyes piercing her opponent. If the law is guided by unwavering principles, then your rulings must be consistent, but they're not. And if they're not consistent, doesn't that mean justice itself is shaken? The public deserves an explanation, not silence. Each question landed like a hammer, striking the heavy air. Reporters could barely keep up with their typing, too busy watching an unprecedented scene. Ketanji Brown Jackson, a justice who once intimidated even seasoned lawyers, now silent before a young opponent, without a law degree. A reporter leaned over, whispering to a colleague, "This isn't the silence of control, this is forced silence." The other nodded, eyes not leaving Jackson, scribbling quickly in their notebook. First time Jackson cornered into not responding. The silence stretched to a tense breaking point, like a steel wire that could snap any moment. Jackson bit her lower lip, a crack briefly visible on her face. Then she looked up, her eyes scanning the room quickly, as if seeking a foothold. But the courtroom remained deathly quiet, every gaze waiting for the answer she didn't give. Leavitt didn't let the chance slip, lowering her voice, but keeping each word sharp. The public doesn't fear change, ma'am. They fear pretended consistency. If you truly believe in flexibility, say so. But if you insist your principles are unwavering, then the contradictions I've just presented are a verdict on that dishonesty. This time, a few soft O's escaped, then quickly faded into the stifling air. Everyone felt they were witnessing, not just a hearing but a forcing one of America's most powerful justices to face her own silence. And in that moment, everyone understood. The balance of power in the courtroom had begun to tilt decisively toward Karoline Leavitt. The prolonged silence from the previous moment felt like a weight pressing down on the room, but Jackson couldn't let her image be framed in helplessness. She took a deep breath, raised her head high, and for the first time since Leavitt began her counterattack, she brought the microphone up, her voice resonant and slightly trembling but full of resolve. "I am the first Black woman to sit here. I carry the legacy of generations excluded from this seat, from this court, from the very Constitution we're debating." Her words fell like a curtain over the entire courtroom. Some in the audience nodded, a few reporters whispered. This was an attempt to shift the narrative away from data contradictions to history and symbolism. Jackson continued, her voice growing stronger. "Every ruling I sign, every word I write, reflects not just legal views, but an affirmation that women, that Black people, that communities once pushed to the margins, now have a voice in this most powerful institution. You can quote every sentence, but you cannot erase the truth that my presence here is a step forward for justice." As her words ended, a few soft claps rose from the audience before being sternly silenced by management. The atmosphere seemed to tilt toward Jackson in that moment. She looked straight down at Leavitt, her eyes flashing as if challenging. "Dare you counter this?" Leavitt stood still, her eyes blazing, but her face maintaining calm. She waited for the murmurs to subside, then stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the wooden podium, her voice resonant but measured. "Dear Justice Jackson, I don't deny that your presence here is historic. That's something the entire nation has recognized. But history is only proud if you're consistent and fair. If a biased ruling causes a veteran to lose their vote, then your race, your gender, or the legacy you carry cannot justify that injustice." The response landed like a hammer, cutting through the symbolic wall Jackson had built. The courtroom fell silent, then erupted in rapid murmurs. Reporters in the front row snapped up, their eyes alight as they caught the moment. Jackson froze, blinking, her hands clasped, trying to hide her unease. But she didn't retreat. Her voice rose, sharp. "You don't understand. Justice isn't just in individual cases brought up for emotional effect. It's in the fact that this system, for the first time in history, has someone like me carrying the voice, the experience of those once oppressed." Leavitt countered instantly, not missing a beat. "Justice doesn't lie in who sits in the chair. Justice lies in the decisions that chair makes. If those decisions shift based on interest groups, then the historic legacy is just a cloak hiding the truth. Ma'am, truth doesn't need color to be valued. It needs consistency." An O escaped from the audience, then quickly died. All eyes turned to Jackson. She bit her lip tightly, trying to keep her voice calm. "Miss Leavitt, you cannot deny that my presence inspires millions. that it has opened a door long sealed for centuries, and you, a young woman, are also benefiting from that door. Leavitt nodded slightly, her eyes shining. Yes, ma'am, and that's why I have a responsibility to speak the truth. That door isn't just open for you, not just for me. It must open for every citizen, from a student, a single mother, to a veteran. If this door only opens to let certain voices be heard while others are dismissed, then we haven't progressed as far as we think. You speak of history, but true history won't remember who sat in this chair. It will remember whether justice was upheld. The statement echoed through the courtroom. A reporter nearly dropped their recorder, scrambling for their pen, writing furiously. Jackson tilted her head slightly, her eyes wavering, her usually upright shoulders slumped just a bit, as if those words had touched a point she didn't want to face. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a legal debate to a battle over the meaning of history and morality. Jackson used her legacy as a shield, but Leavitt turned it into a double-edged sword. By contrasting history with actual fairness, she forced everyone to reconsider, does legacy hold value if it doesn't come with justice? The entire courtroom was deathly silent. The frenetic typing from earlier had stopped. As every reporter looked up, eyes glued to the two figures, turning the debate into a symbolic battle. And everyone understood that, after this moment, everything had transcended the legal realm. This was a question for the entire nation. What does history mean if it doesn't come with true fairness? The room was still reeling from Leavitt flipping Jackson's historical shield. The atmosphere hadn't yet settled when Leavitt leaned down slightly, pulling out a dark green file stamped with the seal of a renowned policy research institute. She placed it on the podium, her hand holding it firmly, her eyes directed straight at Jackson, her voice low but resonant. Dear Justice Jackson, you may call me an outsider, a young politician without a law degree. You may call me a media person, someone performing politics. But what about those who walked the academic path alongside you? Would you dare call them performers? I present to this court a document from Professor Daniel Whitmore, Yale University, a scholar widely known for supporting you during your Supreme Court nomination. He once wrote an article praising you as the consistent and steadfast voice of progressive law. But in a study published earlier this year, he reached a different conclusion. Leavitt flipped open the first page, her voice steady and clear. In a 120-page report, Professor Whitmore analyzed 37 cases you participated in from 2016 to 2024, and he wrote, I quote verbatim, "The common thread in Justice Jackson's rulings is a lack of consistency in principle. In environmental cases, she cites scientific data as an unwavering foundation. In voting rights cases, she dismisses similar data, calling it a localized phenomenon. This inconsistency raises questions that principles are applied arbitrarily based on interest groups." A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. Whispers erupted, not just from the press but also from the public seats, where some exchanged looks of disbelief. A reporter whispered to a colleague, "Whitmore is a true blue liberal. He once wrote a piece defending Jackson in the New York Times." The other nodded, scribbling quickly. This is a counterblow from her own side. Jackson's expression shifted briefly. She sat upright, hands clasped, trying to maintain composure, but her eyes flashed with anger upon hearing Whitmore's name. He was someone who had defended her during her Senate confirmation hearing, who had called her a new breeze for American justice. Now, that very name was being used as evidence of betrayal. Leavitt pressed on, her voice sharp. Not only that, Professor Whitmore specifically highlighted 3 cases. In American Free Speech Alliance versus D.C., you defended absolute free speech. In United States versus Social Media Oversight Board, you supported government control. In People for Equal Ballot Access, you disregarded voter data. But in Environmental Protection League, you deemed environmental data paramount. And he concluded, if a justice claims to rely on unwavering principles but applies them based on political leanings, she has turned the Constitution into a selective tool. The final words echoed, leaving a deadly silence. All eyes turned to Jackson. The woman once seen as unshakable was now facing an attack from the least expected source. The liberal academic community that had elevated her to icon status. Jackson took a breath, attempting to speak, but her voice lacked its usual authority. An academic study is just an opinion. It doesn't bind the court. Leavitt didn't miss a beat, responding immediately, her voice direct. Correct. It doesn't bind, but it exposes. And what's shocking is that it's not conservatives, not political opponents, but the very scholars who once placed faith in you, who had to write those words. When even your own allies can't ignore the inconsistency, the public will ask, where is justice? Another wave swept through the courtroom. Cameras flashed relentlessly. Reporters typed furiously. A justice on the left nodded slightly, while a conservative justice gave a barely concealed smile. Jackson gripped her pen tightly, her face taut, her eyes darkening. This was the second twist, and it hit harder than the last. Not just a leaked memo, but public criticism from her own liberal allies, from someone who had supported her. And everyone understood that this blow had impact, not just in this room, but on the very legacy Jackson had painstakingly built. The room was still reeling from the twist of Professor Whitmore's study. Jackson tried to keep her back straight, but the tension was etched into every line of her face. The atmosphere was thick, and at that moment, Leavitt slowly placed her hand on another file, her voice lowering, as if deliberately guiding the room in a new direction. I've shown contradictions in legal arguments. I've cited a scholar from your own side. But justice doesn't just live on paper. It lives in people's lives, in the hearts of those pushed to the margins. She turned, gesturing toward the back rows, where an elderly woman slowly stood up. She leaned on a slender cane, her white hair gleaming, her hands trembling but her eyes bright and resolute. Leavitt introduced, "This is Miss Eleanor Williams, 84 years old, who lived through the Jim Crow era in the American South. She witnessed her father denied the right to vote simply because of his skin color, and to this day she still faces barriers that history should have buried long ago." The room fell silent, following the woman's every slow step. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse but powerful. "I've lived long enough to know discrimination doesn't vanish easily. I still remember 1964, standing in line at a polling station in Montgomery, and a white official laughed in my face, telling me I had to pay a poll tax to vote. My father turned away, holding my hand tightly, but he never voted again until the day he died. I thought those days were over. But last year, I went to a polling station in Georgia, and they rejected me because the name on my voter card didn't match my marriage certificate from decades ago. I showed my birth certificate, my passport, but they said the new law didn't allow it. I was forced to go home without voting." A sob echoed from the back. A reporter, who had maintained a stoic facade from the start, quietly wiped a tear. Eleanor continued, her voice trembling but fierce. "I've lived long enough to see America move forward. But that day, I felt like I was back in the past, when my vote was dismissed over administrative details. I don't need anyone's pity. I just want my basic right respected, as the Constitution promised." Leavitt stood beside her, turning to look straight at the bench, her voice resounding. "Dear Justice Jackson, you say you sit here representing a historical legacy, but the true historical legacy isn't in who sits in that chair. It's in whether people like Miss Eleanor Williams can walk into a polling station and exercise their right without obstruction." The atmosphere broke into muffled sobs. Many in the audience wiped tears. Some front row reporters froze, unable to type. Even a few justices leaned forward, their eyes softening. Jackson sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the table. Her hand gripped the pen tightly, but this time it didn't tap, didn't move to the microphone to counter. She leaned down, silent, her face turned away so no one could see her true expression. For the first time in the hearing, she couldn't immediately strike back. Leavitt lowered her voice, but it still echoed through the room. "If the justice you represent cannot protect a woman like Miss Eleanor, then that justice isn't enough for history to be proud of. Justice isn't the chair. Justice is the vote in a citizen's hand, regardless of age, race, or name." A heavy silence blanketed the room, and in that silence, everyone felt it. The balance of power had decisively tilted toward Karoline Leavitt. The room remained silent after Miss Eleanor Williams sat down, and that silence was heavier than any defense. All eyes turned to Jackson, waiting for a response, a rebuttal, an effort to salvage her authority. But instead of the usual sharpness, her voice came slowly, weaker. "No one denies the pain of the past, and no one wants to recreate injustice, but the court must balance principle and reality. Sometimes, the law is applied more strictly to maintain order." She hesitated, as if she herself didn't fully believe her words. Some reporters tilted their heads, noting Jackson defensive. Jackson lost control. Leavitt didn't miss the chance. She stepped forward, her voice clear, each word striking like a beat on wood. "Dear Justice Jackson, the law isn't written to maintain order for a system, but to maintain order for people. When a veteran must go home without voting, when a woman who lived through Jim Crow is stopped at the polling booth, The issue isn't order. The issue is that justice has been forgotten. Jackson pursed her lips tightly, gripping the pen like a defensive weapon, but she offered no sharp argument. Instead, she only repeated, "Justice sometimes requires small sacrifices to protect greater interests." The words fell empty, immediately cut off by Leavitt's icy stare. Leavitt turned, sweeping her gaze across the room, from the justices to the public seats, then stopping at the press cameras. Her voice lowered, but echoed to every corner. "You called me elementary, but what's elementary isn't the law. What's elementary is when we forget that the law was written to protect the people." The words landed like a final verdict, and then the courtroom erupted. Applause broke out, first from the public, then spreading to the back rows of the press. Though security quickly signaled for order, the sound roared on, like an unstoppable wave. A few justices sat silently, but their eyes betrayed acknowledgement. Leavitt had taken the upper hand. Jackson sat motionless, her face taut, her eyes lowered, avoiding her opponent. In that moment, she was no longer the untouchable image of the Supreme Court, but a person bearing the weight of truth. Leavitt bowed her head slightly, then slowly gathered her files, each movement calm as if she knew the battle was won. Without another word, she had etched her message into the minds of everyone present, and from that moment, no one in the room thought about who held the higher title or more academic years. They only remembered that a young woman, without a law degree, stood up to challenge a Supreme Justice and ended with a simple but resonant statement, like a ringing wake-up call. The law was written to protect the people. The applause continued to echo even as the Chief Justice's gavel signaled the end of the session. Though unofficial, it was the clearest acknowledgement. Karoline Leavitt left the courtroom with victory hers. After the gavel fell and the courtroom began to clear, the atmosphere inside the Supreme Court remained taut as a bowstring. The applause hadn't yet faded from the memory of those who witnessed it when another exchange began. This time not in public, not under camera lights, but behind the heavy wooden door leading to the justice's private conference room. There, in moments of rare candor seldom leaked outside, a seismic shift was recorded. In the room, the justices sat around a long, polished wooden table, no longer bound by formal protocol but with somber faces. Chief Justice Roberts spoke first, his voice low and cautious. "I think we all felt it. Today was extraordinary. What Miss Leavitt presented, at the very least, it raises questions we can't easily ignore." He rarely acknowledged publicly that an outside witness had shaken the court, but today he knew he had to speak plainly. Justice Alito frowned, arms crossed. She's just a young politician, never sat in a lawyer's chair. Some of her documents, their authenticity could be debated. But then even Alito hesitated, glancing at the file still on the table. But the way she cited colleague Jackson's past rulings, it was precise, down to the word. Across the table, Justice Kagan tapped her pen lightly, sighing. "I never thought I'd see the day when an outsider could trace such a clear thread of contradiction. I don't agree with all of Leavitt's points, but I can't deny the sharpness in how she turned it." Ketanji Brown Jackson sat at the left end of the table, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes fixed on the blank page before her. Throughout the meeting, she spoke less than usual. Typically, after a heated argument, she led the analysis, emphasizing key points to shape arguments for the liberal bloc. But today she was silent, as if each word would only prolong an unwanted echo. Justice Barrett, seated beside her, glanced at Jackson, then spoke, her voice calm but clear. "We're not here to discuss one person's win or loss, but clearly the public will read every word, every line of this hearing. And if we ignore the evidence," Leavitt raised, "will be seen as deliberately turning a blind eye." A few nods appeared around the table. Justice Kavanaugh added slowly, "I saw the public's eyes today. They believed Leavitt. Not because she's perfect, but because she said what many feel, that our consistency is in question. We may not agree with her approach, but we can't deny its impact." Roberts leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "Impact from public opinion, yes, but also from ourselves. I won't say I agree with everything, but some of her points are strong enough that I think when writing opinions, we can't ignore them." All eyes turned to Jackson. She remained silent. After a long pause, she finally looked up, her voice hoarse, brief. "I hear you." No further defense, no counter-argument, just those three words. But in the heavy atmosphere, they rang like an admission. This was the final twist. Not only had public opinion been shaken, but even within the Supreme Court's inner sanctum, the atmosphere had shifted. from a debate thought to be just for public viewing. Now those seated at the most powerful round table in America had to seriously consider Karoline Leavitt's words. After the meeting, the justices quietly left the room, their footsteps heavier than usual. Jackson walked last, her posture straight, but her steps slow, her eyes not leaving the wooden floor. Some colleagues glanced back silently, not with mockery, but with empathy and acknowledgement. She had just endured one of the toughest moments of her career. Meanwhile, Roberts turned back to look at the empty chair after everyone left, sighing softly. He understood that today's hearing would be remembered for years, not just for the clash between two women of different generations, but because it had left a crack in the seemingly untouchable wall of the Supreme Court. The resounding applause from the public had closed the public portion, but the silence in the private conference room was the true sign that this confrontation had planted a seed of change in the heart of the institution, and that was something no justice could ignore. The heavy wooden door of the courtroom closed, but the resonance of the confrontation lingered. The Supreme Court's hallway buzzed with murmurs, not from the press. They had already rushed out to chase breaking news, but from those who had directly witnessed the event. A group of law students huddled against the wall, their eyes still gleaming with awe. One student turned to his friend, voice trembling. "We just witnessed a confrontation that will go down in history books." His friend nodded, face flushed as if they'd just weathered an emotional storm. Not far away, Sergeant O'Connor sat back in his seat, his calloused hand resting on his cane. He said little, only nodding slightly, as if he had just seen vindication, not only for himself, but for fallen comrades. Beside him, Ms. Eleanor Williams wiped the corner of her eye, then whispered, "I've lived long enough to see this day." Justice was finally spoken, not from the bench, but from someone who dared to look them in the eye and remind them. Some seasoned lawyers lingered, exchanging hushed words. One whispered, "That girl, no law degree, no academic pedigree." But her arguments, her sharpness, she left even Jackson unable to counter. Another responded, voice measured, "This is the first time I've seen a young politician shake the walls of the Supreme Court. We may have to cite this moment as a turning point in the future." In the room that had just hosted the fierce verbal battle, the atmosphere still smoldered like embers not yet cooled. The witnesses, students and lawyers, knew they had seen something rare. A Supreme Justice not only challenged but pushed into a defensive corner, with the truth laid bare before the nation. Leavitt stood at the podium, closing her final file, her movements calm as if she had simply completed her task. There was no overt smile of victory, only a resolute gaze and a slight nod toward the public seats where those she defended had sat, witnessed, and wept. Then she gathered her papers, turned and stepped down the stairs, her shoes clicking rhythmically in the vast space. Each step echoed the words she had spoken. The law was written to protect the people. Outside the hallway, camera flashes went off relentlessly. But in the courtroom, another moment unfolded. Jackson remained in her high seat, her face darkened, eyes fixed on the polished wooden table. She didn't leave immediately, as if the weight of what had just happened pinned her there. Her hand rested on the pen, but it neither wrote nor tapped as before. Her silence this time was no longer authority, but a heavy void. The last to leave the room looked back and saw the stark contrast. A young, decisive Leavitt walking away with a calm yet radiant presence, and a Jackson still seated, her face shadowed, bearing the weight of a legacy shaken by a confrontation history would never forget. In that contrast, the echo of the hearing reverberated, not just within the marble walls, but in the minds of all who witnessed this moment. The story of the confrontation between Karoline Leavitt and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in this hypothetical hearing was not just a legal debate, but a test of credibility, consistency, and the power of truth. From specific details, we see how Leavitt gradually gained the upper hand. Initially, she was mocked by Jackson as a press secretary, elementary, interrupted constantly, and seemed unlikely to hold her ground. But her calm demeanor paved the way for sharp counterattacks. When Leavitt presented living evidence, Sergeant O'Connor, a veteran, denied his vote due to a ruling Jackson concurred with. The room fell silent, as the image of someone who sacrificed for the nation, yet was denied a basic civic right, struck everyone's heart. The weight of truth grew heavier when Ms. Eleanor Williams, 84, recounted being denied her vote, raising the question, is justice truly upheld, or does it exist only on paper? The climax escalated when Leavitt cited Professor Whitmore's study, a liberal scholar who once supported Jackson, now pointing out inconsistencies in her rulings. That moment showed the critique no longer came from political opponents, but from within her own circle, ending with the resonant statement, "What's elementary isn't the law, but when we forget that the law was written to protect the people," Leavitt reshaped the entire narrative. The lesson for the American people is, justice lies not in symbols or titles, but in the consistency and integrity of those in power. For leaders, this message reminds them that power, even supreme, can be challenged if it strays from the reality of people's lives. A democracy is only strong when it dares to examine itself and allows the voice of truth from anyone to ring out. Thank you for following this historic confrontation. If you believe this moment deserves to be remembered, please hit subscribe to not miss our next analyses. See you in the next video, where we continue to shed light on the truth behind decisions that could shape America's fate.